Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 10th chapter in the book of Romans. And the 10th chapter opens on an identical note as that of the ninth, Paul's sincere desire and wish for the salvation of his people, the Jewish people, on whose behalf I have great sadness and continual grief in my heart. Verse 2, Paul did not drop a tear, he shed many tears. He lost sleep over the night for the welfare of them. There was nothing passive or passing about the sadness that overcame Paul. He was passionate about his people, and he mourned for their eternal state. He wished that the Jewish people could make the most of all these spiritual advantages they had. But for I myself could have wanted to be banished from Messiah for the sake of my brothers, my relatives according to the flesh. That word banished translates in the Greek original as anathema. It is spelled similarly to anathema, our word, but it is so much more than banished. It is to be cursed with the wrath, the righteous wrath of the hellfire wrath of the Almighty. So Paul was willing to go to hell in order to keep others out of there, and he was willing to stay out of heaven in order that those might go there. That we read in Philippians, the first chapter. And the Jewish people, they had all these wonderful things: the adoptions, the esteem, the covenants. They had three of them. It was Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic, and the giving of the Torah through Moses, and the worship, the temple, and the tabernacle, and the promises. So before anything else, the Jewish nation began with the dispensation of promise when a settled city sophisticate by the name of Abraham was called to go wander to a land that he would claim as his own. A nation would be strong, and it all began with a promise. And Abraham was past the childbearing age. He thought him and his wife had missed their opportunities, but the promise remained in them. But Paul is careful to point out that the failures of the Jewish peoples are not their own. The word of Yahweh remains immutable to error. So it is what it says it is, and it never fails. However, it is not as though the word of Yahweh has failed, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. So he speaks of two Israels. Israel's is just belonging to that nation, sharing the same blood, having Jewish blood in you. And then Israel is the faithful remnant, the elect, which is saved within the Jewish ranks, who make it to heaven. And he really does go all to town with the word. He hops from Genesis to Malachi to Exodus to the prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah to Hosea, and then Isaiah twice more. But we're just going to read the final 4 verses before we hop into the lesson itself. What shall we say then? That Gentiles not following after righteousness, having obtained righteousness, even the righteousness of faith, but Israel following after the Torah of righteousness has not arrived at the Torah of righteousness. So the Gentiles, in spite of not looking for righteousness, they found it because they had the righteousness of faith. They reached out and grasped. They did not have the foundation of the superior and advanced special revelation. All they had was faith, and faith was enough. And the Jews the law was their idol of that time. They were worshiping the law and just their additions to it. And you cannot attain righteousness by the pursuit of the law. The law exists as a mirror to expose that which needs to be eliminated, the sin nature. The law offers no release or salvation from sin. All it does is a mirror which shows our desperate need for salvation, which cannot come from our own righteousness because the law exposes the illusion of that. Why? Not because of faith, but as by works of Torah, for they stumbled at the stone of stumbling. So they missed the mark. They were pursuing righteousness by works. They had an external mindset, that the observable, obeyable commandments, the ones that people could see and document and quantify, was what they were all about. And they missed the stone of stumbling when he was in their midst. The stone of stumbling is capitalized. That is a reference that is recognized as Isaiah. The citation below is from Isaiah 28, but it's also the chief cornerstone in Psalm 118. 10th verse, shorter than usual preamble. We got a lot to cover today. 10th chapter, first verse, lesson itself. Truly, brothers, my heart's desire in prayer to Elohim for Israel is for salvation. his earnest hope and most eager desire, as he says, is for the salvation of Israel. This is foundational to the chapter which preceded it, the one we already covered. He wept and mourned over the fact that many of Israel were lost, and he wished all that the Jewish brothers, the ones he shared the biological blood with, the one whose Abrahamic descent and lineage he belonged to, he wished they could all be saved. But, he was realistic enough to recognize that only a remnant shall be saved. And he did weep over the fate of the lost. He was not passively or indifferent to the welfare of others. He was a deeply selfless man who bore 39 lashes and prisons and persecutions. Also the message. He practiced self-denial to the T. So his heart's desire, though, that is Paul's heart's desire, given his role model qualification, should be our heart's desire. For I bear them witness that they have an ardor for Elohim, but not according to knowledge. This is a self-description of Paul himself. Paul could relate as a young man, zealous for the law, blameless in it, as much as he was able to get away with, certainly. But he missed he was so wrapped up in the worship of the law that he sent out to stamp out these heretics and blasphemers, among whose blasphemous claims may have been that the law was fulfilled. He eventually references the cardinal tenet of the Christian faith, that the Messiah fulfilled the law in the 4th verse. But ardor, now sincerity is only as direction as so sincerity without truth is askew, because let me tell you about the fell on the football field who scooped up a fumble and ran 60 yards in the wrong direction. He was one of the most sincerest fellas alive. But the point is that sincerity is only as good as the direction it is headed. So he was headed in the wrong way. The Jews were the same way. Paul was the same way. He was speaking of himself. So his sin, his mismanagement, his overemphasis was Israel's own. They were not. They had a zeal for the law, but it was not according to knowledge. They did not know what they were doing, why they were doing, or who they were worshiping. For not knowing the righteousness of Elohim and seeking to establish their own righteousness, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of Elohim. That phrase, the righteousness of Elohim, is a phrase which Martin Luther wrestled with. He could not comprehend it, and he really spent a lot of time and intense agony over what precisely that meant and how precisely one could attain it. Martin Luther had the legalistic mindset of the Catholic monk prior to his awakening, shall we call it, when he was reading this epistle and he connected the righteousness by faith and it all. But the righteousness of Elohim is that which belongs to him. It is not anything that we can manufacture or duplicate ourselves. So who are we to even presume to work our way to him? The salvation by works reverses the debt. So by grace, we are indebted to him and him alone. In salvation by works, he is indebted to us. So they are categorically wrong because they do not know the nature of the one who they are trying to make it back home to. For Messiah is the goal of the Torah unto righteousness to everyone who believes. The goal, it means he's the aim and the objective of the law. The law is an intermediary. It is a bridge. It is an inferior form of special revelation. It is still special revelation, but it is an inferior form of revelation to the fullest and the final, most complete, visible, the Word incarnate, Word in the flesh, the Father in all his esteem in human form, who was born without sin, who lived without sin, and died without sin, thus fulfilling the Torah, the law. And the only way that you can possibly save yourself through the law is to never disobey once, and we all do. Break one, you break them all. Sin is not isolated in tandem, and we are only as strong as our weakest link, James 2:10, for the seriousness and the gravity of even a single sin. So the Messiah did what we could not. He could honor and obey the law perfectly, and if we accept that by faith, then his righteousness becomes our righteousness. It is imputed to us on our behalf in spite of ourselves, and all we have to do is believe. It's seriously that simple. We just have to reach out in faith and believe. For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law. The man who does these shall live by them. This reference is in Leviticus 18:5. Moses is trying to stimulate covenantal obedience, according to which if they were obedient, they could expect long life in the land. So he's talking about life as in long life on the land. Paul's talking about eternal life. So life is two different things to do two different audiences, but he does appropriate. It's interesting to examine and explore. One of the things I've been doing in Romans a lot lately is really seeing, taking the Old Testament original and putting it in the frame of its original context just to get the scope. And Paul really does get away with a lot in what he says. But you live by the law, that means you die by it. So if you do these, you have to live by them, you have to walk in them, you have to abide in them. And so this is not something you casually profess, but something you habitually practice. So if you say you are of the law, that means you are bound by the law. We are liberated from the law by the fulfillment of the law. That comes in later to the equation. But the righteousness of faith speaks in this way. Do not say in your heart, who shall ascend into the heavens, that is to bring Messiah down, or who shall descend into the abyss, that is to bring Messiah up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. This is the word of faith which we are proclaiming. He takes a familiar reference in Deuteronomy 30th chapter, and what Moses is talking about is the law, how it was imminent, it was in his possession, it was at his disposal, it was being recorded and written so that they had a guideline to govern themselves for the next several centuries, and the law does remain in effect amongst the Jewish religion. They're covenant keepers. But while Paul is talking about the word, and the law would have been more synonymous with the word for the Jewish people, but the word to the Christian is it has a literal personification. The word who became flesh, it's also the Bible. The word, it's also the creative agent, the thing which spoke the light into existence, that force. But it is the word of faith specifically which we are proclaiming. So Paul presented a systematically consistent theological outlook, which is the one that he is proclaiming. That if you confess, so the law was in Moses' hands. It was being written, so they didn't have to climb to the high heavens to find this rule. They could carry it in a portable. The king of Israel was commanded to carry a portable copy of him wherever he went. The Jews were to have this word in their heart. They were to have it on their foreheads, the Shema, at least, Deuteronomy 6:4, the central faith of Jewish monotheism. But, they were to keep it close and at all times, and it was not so transcendent, not so lofty as to not be in their midst, and it was alive in as much as they abided in it and in as much as they practiced it. So they were not without excuse if ever it wasn't realizing or manifesting in their presence. And then this is the word of faith that he is proclaiming is something miraculous to behold and marvelous to hold. But he's also in the 7th verse. I want to comment on a few things there. This is a reference to the resurrection. Bring Messiah up from the dead. Who among us can do that? None of us can. But the Father and the Son and the Spirit can and did, and that is the central claim. So they bridged the unbridgeable gap, the abyss of death, the abyss of defeat was overcome by the cross, which led to the resurrection and the ascension. So he's up there right now at the right hand of the Father, where he exercises his authority. And this is the message that Paul is proclaiming. And it is in your mouth and in your heart. So it is never so far, and what we speak from our mouth and what dwells in our heart is of salvific significance. It is connected to the correct confession, which is necessary to procure our salvation, of which we soon read. That if you confess with your mouth the Master Yahshua and believe in your heart that Yahweh has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. So the salvation process is quite simple as it's outlined here. It is as seriously as simple as saying it out loud, saying it publicly identifying yourself in the cause that's going to earn you the scorn and ridicule of the world and the hatred and hostility of the world you're trying to save. But, just make yourself known, live out your faith in such a way that is visible, that is transparent. And if you believe in your heart, now the heart is where it all boils down to. So we have to clear the clutter of our heart, cultivate the soil in it to build the garden which can grow if all the pollutants and all the sins and all the toxic influences are harboring in our hearts. We got to get rid of them. And you just have to say the right things and know the right things, but also mean it. So you cannot say it without meaning. You have to believe in your heart. It's one thing to say, I believe that he was resurrected, but I could say it and not mean it. But to say it with umph and to say it with emphasis and to say it with sincerity makes not only a difference, but the difference. And I do believe that he was resurrected, and we will share in the resurrection. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and one confesses with the mouth, and so is saved. Salvation is simple as it is presented here. Salvation is more complex than these two verses alone. But for the sake of argument, let's pretend this was the narrow window of salvation. All you'd have to do, it boils down to a matter of saying, and it boils down to a matter of believing. So if our actions and our words demonstrate our honest reflections of our hearts, if we do it in sincerity and with transparency and with integrity, and do it blamelessly without any ulterior motive or hidden agenda or selfish design or anything, then we will be able to say it and mean it and claim it and look forward to it and behold it. So eternal life begins now. It began a while ago for me, but I could lose it. So because the scripture says, whoever puts his trust in him shall not be put to shame. So this is, where is it? I forgot to record that one, but the point is, when you put your trust in him, the Hebrew word for trust is to have the, that we read of in Proverbs 3:5, is to be in the state of abject surrender as a defeated military icon. So that is the extent that we have to submit to him in our trust with him, and then we shall not be put to shame. Now, a lot of people are put to shame because they are embarrassed for the testimony and the scorn and the ridicule and the rejection and the reproach that they endure while out there witnessing in the world. But if you really believe it, then you'll have some perspective on, you'll be happy to suffer in the sake of the name. Because there is no distinction between the Jew and the Gentile, for the same master of all is rich to all those calling upon him. No difference between him and, the world. The Jewish people certainly looked at the Gentiles as us and them categories. They were tribal people. They kept themselves at deliberate remove and arm's distance, purposeful separation, in as much as was humanly possible with the Gentiles in the age of the Gentiles. But in the Christianity, the wall is battered down, Ephesians 2:14, and the temple is torn, Luke 23, Matthew 21, or 27, whatever. But the important thing is he is no respecter of persons. The plan and path and the formula for salvation is identical for the Jews as it is for the Gentile. It's by grace through faith, and what is true for one is true for the other, for he is not the Elohim of Jews and Gentiles, but of them both, as it is made plain in another passage in this book. And he dispenses his gifts. He doesn't dispense his gifts evenly, but he certainly does give the greater allotment to them those who are calling upon him. And it broke Paul's heart because the Jewish people, the majority of them, were not calling on him with sincere lips and the right faith. For everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh shall be saved. This is referenced in Joel 2:32. Now, in that context, that is the prophecy of the democratic dispensation, which became manifest at Pentecost, and this would have been a central confession of the early Christian church, the simplicity of calling on the name and being saved. Salvation is certainly more complex, but that is part of it. So that's one of the things you need to do. That's a checklist. You have to call on the name, you have to pray on it, you have to publicly proclaim it and identify yourself out there and in public, and then you shall be saved. There's more to it than that, but do that one thing if you haven't yet. How then shall we call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom we have not heard? And how shall they hear without one preaching? So listening, the conversation consists of two elements, two added ingredients, which always perform the talking and the listening. These are the two ingredients in any conversation, and listening is essential. So the way that the things of the Spirit are transmitted is through Spirit-saturated people, through Spirit-saturated audience. They have the eyes to see and ears to hear the spiritual truths which are conveyed through the preaching of the world. So preaching is central to the foundation and the establishment and the sustenance of faith. Preaching is where it all begins. Preaching is why I go to church personally. It's for the preaching. I can live with or without the music. The music is nice to have, but preaching makes the difference for me. And preaching is essential because without it, they're not going to know what we know. They're not going to know how God has impacted our lives, the miracles he has done, the blessings he has bestowed upon them, unless we get out there and announce it out loud and say it within earshot so that other people may believe through our belief. They can catch the contagious effects and the addictive attraction that faith can bring. And how shall they preach if they were not sent? As it has been written, how pleasant are the feet of those who bring the good news of peace, to bring the good news of the good. So if you are not sent, if you are not called, if you are not chosen, but you are preaching, that means you are preaching to no avail and to no effect, because to preach apart from the being commissioned is it's a self-defeating cause, start to finish. But the reference that he does is Isaiah 52:7. This is also familiar. In the 6th chapter of Ephesians, put on the feet to spread the good news, and these are the feet who bring the good news of peace. So peace is a central component of the good news. It is also a message of the kingdom, which is established by the sword. But that's one of the paradoxes. The Prince of Peace vanquishes evil to establish his kingdom of peace. And while we're waiting for that arrival, we are to bring the good news of the good to the ends of the earth. Before the tribulation must come, we have to get this word out across in the nations. And the Bible is banned in 52 countries at the filming of this. However, not all obeyed the good news, for Isaiah says, Yahweh, who shall believe our reports? This reference is recognizable in Isaiah 53:1. This is the suffering servant song. The stanza truly begins in the 11th verse or the 12th verse of the preceding chapter, stanzas of 3, but just the remarkability of what his report. Now, to believe the message of salvation from start to finish is a remarkable thing, and not everyone is going to believe it, and the reception of the message is what creates the divide, and there's a division of those who are within and those who are without, and it all boils down to a matter of belief. Who have you believed his reports? That there was one who was heaven sent, who died for your sins and paid the penalty price, that he became what he was not in order that you could become what you are not, the righteousness of Elohim that Martin Luther struggled for. So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of Yahweh. So faith, hearing, listening, spiritually sensitive ears can detect the language of the Spirit, the sound of the Spirit. We have ears for the Spirit, eyes of sight, eyes of faith, ears of the Spirit, which detect the spiritual things, ingest the spiritual nutrients. It goes down into our heads, fills our hearts, floods our fibers. But this contagious fire of faith all begins. What comes into our ear is what we let into our heart. So we have to, it has to pierce our ear, go in, strike with conviction, and then we will be faithful through having heard the word. So faith, without hearing, there is no faith, and so better present it well when you are presenting the faith. But I asked, did they not hear? Yes, indeed. Their voice went out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Again, this is Psalm 19:4, when David is exclaiming the extent of natural revelation in the context of a sun whose rays rise from the east and settle in the west, and vice versa. And so that is a reflection of the Creator in his creation wherever he goes. So his message is to the ends of the earth, because the sun does that way. Paul narrows down the focus to personal evangelism, human evangelism, the witness of natural creation. Now the witness of personal evangelism is something different from the revelation. So we witness of the revelation and of God working in our lives and doing these fantastic things in us and through us that we could never do ourselves. But I asked, did Israel not know? First Moses said, I shall provoke you to jealousy by those who are not a nation. I shall enrage you by an unwise nation. This is Deuteronomy 32:21. This is near the conclusion of the covenantal sermon of Moses. This is his parting farewell address, and they had the record. Paul is careful to point out, does not Israel know? They had the warning. They had the advanced alert knowledge through the writings of Moses, whom they claimed to adhere to, claimed to live by. But he's applying this into, now Moses is speaking of the covenantal violations of the exile. So if they disobeyed, they would be ruled and dominated by a nation that was not their own, and they will be, these cruel barbarians or savages who rape and pillage their homeland and carry them away. These pagan idolaters will be unwise nations, but they will be instruments nonetheless in the bringing the chastisement on the wayward Israelites. So the Israelites are not without excuse, the Jewish people. Paul just wants to lay that on the line. He closes with a citation of Isaiah from his 65th chapter, first two verses, and the 20th and the 21st verse respectively. We're going to take them one at a time. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those not seeking me. I was made manifest by those not asking for me. 800 years before this even happened, Isaiah could claim with confidence, he could claim with certainty, he could claim with courage and boldness that always, even on the most unlikely people, Yahweh makes himself known, works his wonders, is available. And the people who he came to were not even seeking him. They did not have the righteousness of Torah, which led them to a dead-end trap. They had the righteousness of faith, the flimsy foundation. They were not seeking him. Then Jewish men like Paul came and proclaimed this good news, and faith cometh by hearing, hearing by the word of Elohim. So it was all there. And to Israel he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and back-talking people. The prophet was not shy to indict and condemn his own people, the wayward, covenant-violating, stiff-necked, hard-hearted, stubborn ox nation of Israel, who were rebels from the beginning. And so they had forsaken the blessings that they had been given and had been passed on to those who made better use of them, and they had the righteousness of faith. So Paul is writing, he longs above all else to bring the Jewish people to return to the fold, and there is an end time Jewish conversion of the Jewish people that is going to play out, but we don't have time for today. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.